My name is Emily Harper. I'm 39, and I teach business administration at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. Ryan and I had been married for nearly 15 years. From the outside, our marriage seemed flawless. A picture-perfect life, complete with a beautiful suburban house, 2 successful careers, and vacations planned meticulously each year. But beneath that carefully curated facade, things had begun to crumble slowly, so gradually that I'd managed to convince myself not to notice. Everything changed one Thursday evening. Ryan was in the shower, the distant rush of water echoing softly through the hall. His phone, carelessly left on our nightstand, vibrated gently, casting a faint glow across the dim room. I'd never been the type to invade anyone's privacy, especially my husband's. Trust was paramount. But at that moment, a nagging, unshakable feeling overcame me. Almost against my will, I glanced down, my eyes landing on the notification. Your reservation for 2 at Elixir is confirmed for Saturday at 8:00 p.m. Window seat as requested. She'll love it. My breath caught sharply. Elixir was the high-end restaurant we'd promised ourselves we'd visit on our 10th anniversary. A promise Ryan had broken last minute because of an urgent work commitment. Now 2 years later, he was planning an intimate dinner there with someone else. Before I fully grasped what I was doing, my fingers trembled as I entered Ryan's passcode, our anniversary date. Within seconds, an entirely new world unveiled itself. Dozens of messages, photos, and intimate conversations stretched back almost a year. They painted a devastatingly clear picture. Ryan and Madison, a young, vibrant woman from the marketing department at his firm, were deeply involved. A sharp ringing filled my ears, my heart pounded, and the room seemed to blur. I stared at a recent photo from a supposed business trip to Aspen. Madison was nestled comfortably in Ryan's embrace, his smile radiating happiness I'd long forgotten existed. "Have you seen my navy tie, Em?" Ryan's casual voice jolted me back to reality. I felt paralyzed, but my voice came out steady, betraying nothing. "Second drawer on the left," I answered smoothly, slipping his phone back to its original position. He thanked me, oblivious, and continued humming a cheerful tune from the bathroom. That night, as Ryan slept peacefully next to me, I lay wide awake. Each breath he took seemed to mock my agony. How many times had I dismissed his late-night absences, the foreign scent lingering on his shirts, the subtle evasions whenever I asked about his day? I had convinced myself it was stress, a demanding career, anything but betrayal. By morning, I'd made up my mind. As Ryan kissed me goodbye before leaving for his early client meeting, I forced a smile, my mask perfectly in place. "Have a great day," I said warmly. His eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his expression before he walked out the door. The moment the door clicked shut, I picked up my phone and called the university's administration office. 3 days of leave. I needed time not to grieve, but to carefully plan. I wasn't going to be the broken, hysterical wife. I refused to play that role. Ryan's meticulous calendar confirmed the date and time of his rendezvous at Elixir. Saturday, 8:00 p.m. Perfectly noted, perfectly planned, a betrayal executed with precision. My own precision would have to match his. It took me less than 10 minutes to find Madison's husband online, Ethan Porter, a successful architect in Fort Collins, whose warm smile in his profile picture spoke volumes. He had no idea that, like me, his world was about to shatter. Reaching out directly was too obvious. Instead, I crafted a believable professional invitation. "Dear Mr. Porter, I'm Emily Harper, a business professor at Colorado State. We're hosting a special seminar on innovative architecture practices. Your recent projects in the River District are fascinating. I'd love to discuss the possibility of your participation. Could we meet at Elixir this Saturday at 8:00 p.m. to discuss details? Sincerely, Emily Harper." Ethan's reply arrived swiftly, polite, enthusiastic, completely unaware of the truth simmering beneath my invitation. I called Elixir, directly requesting a table beside the reservation under Ryan's name, casually mentioning it was for potential business associates. The hostess cheerfully complied, Saturday evening arrived, and I selected a teal silk dress that Ryan had once deemed too bold for a business dinner. My hair was gathered elegantly, makeup subtle but precise, heels delicate but empowering. This was not merely dinner, it was a strategic engagement. Stepping into Elixir, I followed the hostess to our strategically chosen table. My pulse quickened as I imagined Ryan's face when he realized I was there, calmly unraveling his deception. Ethan arrived moments later, tall, polite, and effortlessly professional. He shook my hand warmly, completely unaware of the storm about to unfold. "Emily Harper," he asked, voice pleasantly deep. "Mr. Porter, thank you for coming," I replied, maintaining perfect composure despite the rapid pounding of my heart. Our small talk about architecture and innovation barely registered as my attention subtly shifted to the entrance. Right on cue, Ryan walked in, Madison on his arm, dazzling in a red dress that announced their romantic intentions plainly. They laughed softly, blissfully, unaware of my presence, until Ryan's eyes landed squarely on mine. He froze, momentarily speechless, and Madison's expression mirrored his panic. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. Turning to Ethan, I excused myself politely. "Just a moment, Mr. Porter," I said, rising gracefully from my seat. The time had come not for a loud public confrontation, but for a calculated, quiet unveiling of the truth. As I stepped away from the table, my heels clicked against the polished wood floors of Elixir. Each step deliberate, steady, like a metronome counting down to the collision about to unfold. My palms felt cool even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. This wasn't just a dinner or a confrontation, it was the architectural drawing of my freedom being drafted line by line, choice by choice. I took my time walking toward Ryan and Madison, allowing them to feel every beat of realization. His face was drained of color. His jaw slackened slightly, betraying his surprise but also his fear. For once, I held all the cards, and he knew it. Madison's eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, a distraction, an excuse, anything but the truth she was about to meet face to face. I paused a few feet from their table, catching Madison's gaze first. "Madison," I said calmly, letting her name hang in the air like a question, like an accusation, like a verdict, all at once. She swallowed hard, fingers tightening on the stem of her wine glass. Then I turned to Ryan, letting the smallest smile graze my lips, not out of malice, but of clarity. "What a coincidence seeing you here," I added as if we were casual acquaintances bumping into each other at the grocery store, not a wife and husband whose lives were about to implode publicly. Before Ryan could fumble for an answer, I turned away, glancing toward Ethan, who was still seated at our table watching the entire scene unfold with a confused but curious expression. "Ethan," I called over my voice, still gentle but with an undertone that left no doubt that this wasn't an innocent business dinner anymore. "Would you mind joining us for a moment? I believe there's someone here you should meet." And there it was, the trap perfectly sprung. No shouting, no scenes, just the unbearable weight of truth laid bare in a softly lit, high-end restaurant where secrets had come to die. Ethan approached slowly, polite curiosity etched across his face, his architect's eye probably catching the tension in every detail. The sharp way Madison held her breath, Ryan's rigid shoulders, the tremor at the edge of my smile. "Ethan." I began standing squarely between Ryan and Madison. "This is my husband, Ryan Harper." "Ryan, this is Ethan Porter, Madison's husband." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the crystal glasses set neatly on the table. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the waiters sensed the shift in atmosphere. Their polite chatter fading as they passed by, eyes carefully averted, but ears likely straining to catch every word. And just like that, Ryan's carefully constructed double life collapsed like a poorly designed structure where one critical load-bearing beam had been quietly removed. In this case, that beam was me, and I had walked away without a sound. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire marriage building stability, a household, a shared life, a future planned around mutual trust. But trust, I'd come to learn, was a foundation only as strong as the person choosing to honor it. And Ryan, he had carved rot into every beam until the entire house was ready to fall. Emily White, Ryan finally stammered, but I raised a hand, cutting him off effortlessly. Not here, I said quietly, firmly. This isn't the place for apologies, you don't mean. And then I turned to Ethan, whose face had transformed in the space of a breath from confusion to comprehension to devastation. His eyes glistened, but he held himself together with remarkable grace. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, I said, truly meaning it. But maybe we both needed to see this together. Ethan nodded slowly, lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers flexing at his sides like he was physically holding himself upright. I could feel the tremor beneath the surface, that shared pain we now both carried like fresh wounds. With that, I left them standing there, frozen in their shame and discomfort, and returned to our table, where I calmly picked up my glass of water and took a sip, savoring the cool clarity it brought to my dry throat. Ethan sat back down after a long moment, folding his hands carefully on the table, as though anchoring himself to something tangible. You knew, he said quietly, not accusingly, just confirming the obvious. Yes, I replied simply. I found out a few days ago. I didn't know how else to tell you, but I thought you deserved to see it with your own eyes. A beat of silence passed between us, the kind of silence that holds both sorrow and relief at once. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan let out a small, sad laugh. Well, he said, shaking his head slowly, at least now we both know what we're dealing with. That one line was like a balm acknowledgement, without drama, pain, without cruelty. I nodded, feeling the strange camaraderie that betrayal can forge between two strangers. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Do you want to stay here and finish dinner? He asked. His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed the swirl of emotions beneath. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, I said at last, surprising even myself. Why not? The food is excellent, and the company just became infinitely more honest. And so we stayed. We ate, we talked, not about them, but about ourselves, our work, our lives. I found out that Ethan loved old jazz records and collected vintage cameras. He learned that I had once dreamed of running a small cafe bookstore on the side, a dream I'd buried somewhere beneath lesson plans and faculty meetings. We discovered in those 2 hours what Ryan and Madison had long forgotten, that genuine connection isn't built on lies. Around dessert, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure, that would take time, but clarity. I was no longer playing the role of the devoted wife waiting at home for a man whose affections belonged elsewhere. I was someone new, someone who could sit across from a near stranger and find companionship in shared hurt without drowning in it. As we finished coffee, Ethan glanced down at the check that the waiter had discreetly placed beside him. I'll get this, he said softly, with a rueful smile. Think of it as the least I can do after the evening you've planned. But I placed my hand over his. Let's split it, I said gently, meeting his gaze. 50-50 feels right tonight. And that was the truth, balanced, even, fair, a symmetry neither of us had known in our marriages for a very long time. When we stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights shimmered around us, casting a soft glow that felt strangely comforting. Ethan and I lingered at the curb for a moment, unsure of what this night would mean tomorrow. Are you going to be okay? I asked, honestly concerned. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. I think so, eventually. Me too, I said quietly. We didn't make promises, didn't exchange numbers. We simply shared a look, an understanding, and parted ways. No drama, no spectacle, just the first quiet steps of two people rebuilding themselves from the wreckage left behind by others. As I walked toward my car, I couldn't help but notice the irony of it all. In architecture, the most beautiful structures often rise after a collapse, stronger, more thoughtfully designed, more resilient. Maybe that's what this was, the demolition before the rebuild. At that thought, a strange calm washed over me. The life I had so carefully built with Ryan was gone, but what remained was a blueprint for something better. The next chapter would be mine to design detail by detail, choice by choice. But even as I reached my car door, I knew this wasn't over. Ryan would come home eventually. There would be explanations, tears, desperate promises, and perhaps even accusations of cruelty for orchestrating this night. And I would be ready for all of it. The foundation was gone, but my walls were up now, stronger than ever. Tomorrow would bring the fallout, the pleading, the questions he didn't want answered. But tonight, for the first time in what felt like years, I breathed freely. And as I slid behind the wheel, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. A promise I made to myself, and this time I would keep it. I will never let anyone make me small again. The car engine hummed softly as I pulled into traffic, heading home alone but not empty, because I knew exactly who I was now. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The drive home that night felt unreal. Fort Collins glowed quietly as I steered through its familiar streets, but everything felt foreign, like I was passing through a place I used to live but no longer belonged. Each red light seemed to invite reflection. How many years had I sat at these intersections believing I was part of a marriage built on mutual respect, only to realize I'd been holding up its facade alone? I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't replay the evening in my mind. I simply drove calmly, deliberately, every mile, taking me further from the person I had been. When I pulled into our driveway, the house sat there perfectly still under the moonlight. The porch light was on its warm glow, meant to welcome, but tonight it felt hollow like everything else in this place. I unlocked the front door with a composure that didn't match the storm underneath, and stepped into the foyer, inhaling the scent of cedar and the faint trace of Ryan's cologne lingering in the air. My reflection caught in the hall mirror, and for a fleeting moment, I didn't recognize myself. But there I was, still standing, still steady, a woman who had orchestrated a clean, surgical reveal of betrayal, and who would now face the quieter war reclaiming her life. In the kitchen, I sat at the marble counter we'd chosen together years ago, tracing its cold veins with my fingertips. I poured myself a glass of wine, not to numb myself, but as a symbolic gesture. This was the last time I would sit in this kitchen as Ryan's wife. The glass felt weighty in my hand, but I held it anyway, aware that every ritual of this home was suddenly stripped of meaning. Even as I drank, I mapped my next move. It wasn't enough to expose Ryan publicly. I needed a plan that secured my independence, my dignity, and my future. Over the next 2 days, while Ryan texted casual updates about work, running late, and demanding clients, I transformed into a strategist. I consulted a lawyer, discreetly choosing one who specialized in high-net-worth divorce cases. Each meeting felt like walking deeper into a labyrinth I never imagined navigating, but with every document I signed, I felt lighter, like I was cutting ropes that had bound me for far too long. My lawyer, Janine, was sharp-measured and pragmatic, but even she seemed slightly impressed by how precise my documentation was: screenshots of messages, financial records, showing hidden spending, and a timeline so meticulous it looked like it had been prepared for a trial. What made it easier was this strange duality. I was devastated, yes, but I wasn't broken. In fact, I felt more alive than I had in years, as if betrayal had stripped away an old skin and left me sharper, clearer. The next risk was not legal, but emotional. I would not wait for Ryan to come home and plead his case. I would confront him not with rage, but with clarity, and force him to confront himself. I sent a text late Sunday evening, brief and direct. "We need to talk tonight. I know everything." He didn't reply immediately, but I knew he read it. Hours later, around midnight, I heard the garage door lift, and then the quiet shuffle of his steps entering through the mudroom. I remained seated at the dining table, dressed in a simple navy sweater, no makeup, hair tied back. There was no performance needed now, only truth. When Ryan walked in, his eyes were tired but wary. His tie was loosened, blazer draped over his arm. He looked like a man who'd rehearsed his excuses and apologies all the way home, but who knew deep down they wouldn't work. I let the silence speak first, and it was deafening. "I assume you've prepared something to say," I said, my tone as even as possible. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair, his eyes darting everywhere but meeting mine. "Emily," no stories, I interrupted, just honesty, for once. The pause that followed was thick with tension. He finally sat across from me, leaning forward as though proximity might save him. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he began. "Madison, she made me feel—" "Spare me," I said gently but firmly. "You made choices. This wasn't an accident. It was a year of deliberate deception." I watched his shoulders sag slightly under the weight of that truth, but I pressed forward, refusing to let this slip into a pattern of half-truths and hollow regret. "This house is sold in 6 weeks." I continued, sliding a document across the table, an agreement drafted by Janine. "I'm moving out by Friday. You can have your lawyers look at this, but it's fair more than fair, actually." His face twisted, part shock, part fear. "Emily, wait. We can talk this through. Please don't do this so quickly." I almost laughed, but there was no humor left. "Quickly, Ryan, you've been gone for months even when you were here. This is not quick. This is overdue." The house felt different, as we spoke no longer home, but a structure filled with echoes of a life that had ended long before that night at Elixir. The dining table where we once hosted friends now felt like a boardroom table where negotiations played out. Even the framed photos on the wall, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, seemed to mock us with their frozen smiles and polished veneers. Ryan reached for my hand reflexively, but I pulled it back gently. "I'm done being the woman who waits for you to come back to her emotionally. I'm done holding a place for someone who doesn't show up." His lips trembled, words failing him for the first time in years. And in that failure, I found an unexpected peace. I stood, gathering the papers into a folder, leaving one copy on the table. "Read this. I'll expect your signature by Thursday," I said, my voice calm but immovable. Before I left the room, I paused, turning back briefly. "You never noticed the cracks, Ryan," I said quietly. But I did. I just didn't want to admit how wide they'd grown. And with that, I climbed the stairs to the guest room, my room now leaving him sitting there, head in his hands, surrounded by all the hollow trophies of a life he'd chosen to tear apart. The next morning, I awoke to birdsong outside the window. A strange serenity settled over me as I packed a small suitcase ready to move temporarily into a rented loft downtown. I chose to leave before he woke, a symbolic act of reclaiming my independence quietly but decisively. Yet even as I closed the front door behind me, suitcase in hand, I felt the next confrontation looming, not with Ryan, but with my own past. All those years of believing that success meant maintaining a perfect household, a perfect marriage, a perfect image, those beliefs were crumbling too. The cracks weren't just in my relationship, but in the social myths I'd clung to. That longevity equaled happiness, that sacrifice without reciprocity was noble, that love could excuse lies if wrapped in enough charm. And I was done. As I walked down the street that morning, the autumn air crisp and clear, I spotted an old sycamore tree I'd passed 1,000 times but never really noticed. Its branches were gnarled, imperfect, some split and scarred. But still, it stood tall, weathered but beautiful in its resilience. I paused, hand resting on the rough bark, feeling the symbolism deeply. This was me now, no longer hiding fractures but owning them, letting them be part of my story, not a flaw to conceal. I took a deep breath, feeling both grief and freedom intermingle in my chest. And just as I was about to continue walking, my phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. "Emily, this is Ethan. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. I think I could really use a coffee. No expectations, no pressure, just some company that understands." For the first time in days, I smiled, not because I needed saving, not because I was ready for something new, but because human connection still mattered even when everything else fell apart. And that small, unexpected invitation cracked the door open to the next chapter, one I hadn't planned for, but one I would write entirely on my own terms. The coffee shop Ethan had chosen was small, tucked into the corner of an old brick building downtown. One of those places that felt like it had always been there, unchanged, unimpressed by passing trends. As I stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries wrapped around me like a blanket. I spotted him almost immediately at a table by the window, 2 mugs already set down, steam curling from their rims. He looked tired but collected, wearing a simple gray sweater, his hair slightly tousled, and a cautious kindness in his eyes. I hesitated just a breath before sitting across from him, unsure what this encounter really was. Grief support. A strange camaraderie between 2 people blindsided by the same betrayal, or simply 2 adults seeking a brief reprieve from their private storms. "Good morning," he said softly, pushing 1 mug toward me. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic and smiled faintly. Neither was I. There was a quiet between us that felt different from silence with Ryan. A quiet that didn't require filling, didn't demand explanations or apologies. It just existed as if we both understood there were no right words for what had happened. We talked at first cautiously about small things, the weather, work, the books on the cafe shelves. But slowly our conversation drifted deeper, almost without realizing it, into the places where hurt lived. Ethan confessed that he had suspected Madison was slipping away but hadn't had the courage to confront it. I admitted that I had felt lonely for years, pretending we were still partners while carrying the whole weight of the relationship on my back. At some point, Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples lightly. "Do you ever feel like all this," he gestured vaguely around us, "this image of marriage, stability, success, it's just a performance we got trapped in?" His words hit a nerve. I thought about how I'd spent years maintaining the illusion, the smiling holiday cards, the perfectly arranged dinner parties, the tidy house that always looked ready for guests, but never felt like home. It had been a role, and I had played it well, even as it drained something essential out of me. "I do," I said quietly. And I think the hardest part isn't that they cheated. It's that they made us question if we were somehow lacking, when the truth is they were the ones afraid to show up honestly. Ethan nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Yeah, Madison always wanted everything to look perfect. I thought that's what she needed. I thought that was love, keeping things neat and pretty on the outside, no matter how lonely it felt underneath." That conversation wasn't about blaming them anymore. It was about confronting the deeper lie we had both lived inside, that our worth was tied to being the perfect spouse, the good partner, the dependable one who stayed and forgave and adjusted endlessly. But the world was shifting under our feet now. I felt it every day since that night at Elixir. The rules I had lived by no longer made sense, and it was terrifying and liberating all at once. We finished our coffee, but neither of us got up right away. The pause felt meaningful, like we were both hovering on the edge of a new chapter, but not rushing to turn the page. Finally, Ethan spoke again, softer this time. "Do you want to go for a walk?" It wasn't a loaded question. It wasn't a date. It was just 2 people choosing not to sit alone with their thoughts for a little longer. We stepped outside, the late autumn air cool against our faces. The sidewalks were lined with trees whose leaves were almost all gone, their bare branches reaching upward like outstretched hands. I found myself studying those trees, exposed, stripped down to nothing, but still standing, still beautiful in their stark honesty. And for the first time, I felt kinship with them. As we walked, Ethan shared stories about his childhood, his ambitions, his plans, before everything fell apart. I listened closely, not as someone seeking a new partner, but as a fellow traveler who understood that rebuilding starts by telling your story to someone willing to hear it. The twist came unexpectedly as we turned a corner near an art gallery. Ethan stopped suddenly, his face unreadable. "My firm designed that building," he said quietly. "Madison never came to the opening, said she was too busy. Turns out she was probably with Ryan that night." The rawness in his voice caught me off guard, and I reached out instinctively, resting my hand on his arm, grounding him. He looked at me and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that said he was both grateful and deeply sad at the same time. It made me realize something: we weren't just grieving lost marriages. We were grieving the time, energy, and love we had given to people who didn't know how to cherish them. "I'm sorry," I said simply, because there was nothing else to say that would matter. And as we stood there, I understood that this was the risk, allowing yourself to feel again. To connect even when connection felt dangerous after betrayal. It wasn't about romance. It was about refusing to let betrayal close me off entirely. Later that afternoon, after we parted ways with a promise to meet again, not as saviors for each other, but as people learning how to be whole on their own, I walked back to my rented loft. The space was small, minimalist, with bare walls and a single window overlooking the quiet street. But it felt right, somehow, like a blank canvas. That evening, I unpacked a box I hadn't touched yet, filled with old journals from my 20s, back when I'd been hopeful, idealistic, convinced that life would follow a linear upward path if I just worked hard and did everything right. I flipped through the pages, rereading entries where I'd written about dreams that no longer fit, beliefs that no longer held. And I realized that my entire adult life had been shaped by a false promise that love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant staying silent, that a good woman was one who endured quietly. But endurance isn't love, and silence isn't loyalty. As I closed the journal, I felt something subtle but powerful shift inside me, a redefinition of who I was and what I would demand from life going forward. The next morning, before dawn had even crept into the sky, I sat at my kitchen counter drafting an email, not to Ryan, but to the department chair at the university. I proposed a new course for the spring semester, The Architecture of Trust: How Structures, Systems, and Relationships Succeed or Fail. It was personal, it was risky, it was exactly what I needed. When I hit send, I felt an unexpected lightness, as if by naming what I had been through and offering it as a lens for others to learn from, I was claiming ownership over my narrative again. The email was more than a syllabus proposal, it was my declaration of independence. My way of saying this chapter of my life may have been shaped by betrayal, but the next chapter would be about building something true, intentional, and entirely mine. And as the sun finally began to rise, casting warm light over the bare walls of my loft, I made a silent vow that would carry me forward. I would no longer measure my worth by how much I endured. I would no longer stay where my presence was taken for granted. I would build a life that felt like home, not for anyone else, but for myself. And with that, I took my first sip of coffee for the day, savoring its warmth like a quiet promise to myself that this was just the beginning. The weeks that followed passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The loft I rented felt bare but comforting, every empty surface a reminder that I had left behind the clutter of a life that had long outlived its truth. I began to develop a kind of ritual that steadied me each day. Black coffee in the morning light, a walk through Old Town after work, and late night scribbling notes for my new course, The Architecture of Trust. A title that made me smile every time I typed it. It felt almost ironic, but also precisely right. If I couldn't salvage trust in my marriage, I would at least teach my students how to recognize its blueprints, its flaws, its cracks. But beneath that calm routine, I was walking a tightrope. Ryan wasn't gone yet. Though I had moved out, he remained in the house, sending occasional texts that alternated between polite questions about logistics and desperate attempts at reconciliation. Each message was a test of my resolve, and each time I chose silence, it felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. The divorce papers had landed in his inbox a week earlier, carefully prepared and more generous than fairness required. My attorney, Janine, had advised me to expect resistance. People like Ryan, she'd said carefully during one of our early meetings, they don't like losing control, especially when the other person exits gracefully. It was true. Ryan's control had always been subtle, woven into daily life so expertly that it didn't feel like dominance. But looking back, I could see it clearly: the decisions about where we vacationed, the pressure to attend social events that suited his career. Even how he'd gently but persistently steered me away from my dream of opening that cafe bookstore. All disguised as care. All designed to keep me orbiting his ambitions. And I had complied for years, wearing the badge of a supportive partner while slowly disappearing in my own life. Now that badge was gone, and Ryan was unraveling. His messages became more erratic, less polished. A hint of bitterness crept into his words. "I hope this is worth it," he wrote one night. "You're throwing away everything we built." But we hadn't built anything together, not really. I had decorated the walls while he hollowed out the foundation. And yet there was a part of me that hesitated. Because walking away is never just freedom, it's loss too. Loss of familiarity, of shared history, of a version of yourself that you believed was permanent. I mourned that woman, even though I knew she was gone. On a cold Wednesday evening, a knock at my door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I peered through the peephole, my breath caught Ryan standing there, coat unbuttoned, hair slightly disheveled, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Against my better judgment, I opened the door halfway but kept my posture steady. "Emily," he began, voice soft, almost cracked. "Please, can we talk? Just talk." Every instinct told me to shut the door, but part of me wanted to hear him not to forgive, but to understand how he would explain what he'd done when stripped of excuses. So I stepped aside, letting him enter. It was a risk, but I needed to see this through on my terms. Inside, Ryan looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confident veneer he had always carried. He sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped, staring down at the floor. I remained standing, arms folded. "I know I don't deserve this chance," he said quietly, "but I don't even recognize myself anymore." The irony was sharp. He didn't recognize himself, but I had seen exactly who he was clearly, finally. "I didn't come to beg," he continued after a long pause. "I came because I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us. About me." The pause between those words said everything. For the first time, perhaps he was separating the two, understanding that us had always been defined by what he needed, not what I wanted. I stayed silent, letting him speak. I realized something he said slowly, his fingers tightening into fists. "I don't think I ever saw you. Not really. I think I saw what I wanted you to be, and I convinced myself that was enough." A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. "You think that's new to me?" I asked gently, but without mercy. "I knew you didn't see me, Ryan. I just didn't want to admit it." He looked up at me, then his eyes wet, but finally clear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But I didn't need the apology. It was too late for that. And yet this was a critical twist, not a man begging for a second chance, but a man realizing, perhaps truly for the first time, that he had squandered what could have been real. It was no longer about me needing to leave him. It was about him being forced to confront that I already had. In that moment, I felt the balance shift entirely. I was no longer reacting to him. I was simply witnessing him as he tried far too late to understand. "I'm not angry anymore," I told him truthfully. "That's what you don't realize. I'm sad and relieved and done." Those 3 words, simple as they were, seemed to land heavier than any accusation or outburst I could have thrown at him. He nodded slowly, as though the truth was finally reaching him. Then he stood, straightening his coat. "You've changed," he said quietly, almost in awe. "I hope so," I replied. Without another word, he left, closing the door gently behind him. And this time, I locked it not out of spite, but out of certainty. That night, I sat at my tiny kitchen table, alone but whole. I poured myself another glass of wine, turning it slowly in my hands. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This drink wasn't an escape. It was a toast to clarity, to endings, to beginnings not yet written. As I looked around my simple loft, I realized something profound. All those years, I thought I was building a life with Ryan. What I was really building was a cage, a beautiful, well-furnished cage. And now that it was gone, I didn't need to rush into building something new. I could stand in this empty space and breathe. The next morning, before sunrise, I walked through a nearby park, my scarf pulled tight against the cold. The bare branches of winter trees reached toward a pale sky, and I felt kinship with them again, stripped bare but enduring, vulnerable but strong. And that's when I saw Ethan sitting alone on a bench near the pond, coffee in hand, staring out over the frozen water. He glanced up as I approached, surprised but not unhappy. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked with a crooked smile. I shook my head. "No, but it's okay." He patted the bench beside him, a quiet invitation. No expectations, no pressure, just shared company again. I sat down next to him, feeling the cold of the bench seep through my coat, grounding me in this exact moment. Neither of us spoke for a while. We didn't need to. The silence between us was different now, comfortable, accepting. And that's when he surprised me, not with a question or a confession, but with a simple statement. "You're stronger than you realize," he said. I smiled, not in denial, but in recognition. I'm starting to believe that I admitted. The sky lightened slowly, the sun breaking gently over the horizon. And as it did, I felt something open in me, not a rush toward romance, not a desire to be rescued, but a quiet readiness to keep walking this path, even if it meant walking alone. Because I wasn't really alone anymore. I had myself, and that was finally enough. But just as I stood to leave, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A new message. I glanced down, expecting another stray text from Ryan, but froze when I read the sender's name. Madison. A chill ran down my spine, not fear, but curiosity. What could she possibly want now? And with that, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. The next chapter would begin with opening that message, but not tonight. Tonight, I would savor this dawn, this quiet, this fragile, beautiful peace. When I finally opened Madison's message, hours after that unexpected buzz in my coat pocket, the air was still and the early morning sunlight stretched softly across my loft. The simplicity of her message struck me first. No long-winded justification, no pleas for forgiveness, no manipulative apology. Just 8 words. "I need to speak to you, alone, please." For a brief moment, I felt my pulse quicken, some reflex buried deep within me still responding to the idea that her presence had once meant a threat. But then I breathed out slowly, steadying myself. There was nothing left for Madison to ruin. She couldn't touch me anymore unless I let her. Still, curiosity tugged. And there was power in meeting her on my terms face to face. A risk, yes, but a deliberate one. The part of me that had once avoided confrontation no longer existed. I replied simply tomorrow. 2 p.m., Café Perennial. Café Perennial sat quietly on a shaded street, a place known for its slightly faded elegance, mismatched china, and the ivy that curled insistently around its windows. It felt right, symbolically aged, imperfect, and enduring. The next day, I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a seat in the far corner where I could watch the door. Madison arrived on time, dressed in muted colors. I'd never seen her wear gray coat, pale scarf, face bare of makeup. Even from a distance, I could sense she was diminished somehow. No longer the magnetic laughing woman who had stolen Ryan's attention. Instead, she moved carefully, with a wariness that suggested her world had fractured too. When she reached my table, she hesitated, then sat down opposite me without a word. For a while, we didn't speak. We just watched each other, 2 women on either side of a shattered boundary. Finally, she broke the silence. "You destroyed him," she said, almost in awe. Her words landed oddly, not an accusation, exactly, more like observation. I sipped my coffee calmly, then set the cup down. "No, Madison. He destroyed himself. I just stopped protecting him from the consequences." She flinched slightly, then looked away, fingers curling around the rim of her own untouched mug. "I didn't come here to beg or explain," she continued. "I came because I'm pregnant." That word cut through the air between us with surgical precision. Pregnant. In that moment, a dozen emotions crashed together inside me: surprise, disbelief, anger, even a twinge of pity. But mostly clarity. "Ryan knows," I asked evenly. She shook her head. "Not yet. I found out 2 days ago. I don't even know why I told you first." I did. Because somewhere inside her, she knew that this conversation was about more than betrayal now. It was about lineage legacy, the wreckage we leave behind when we pretend our actions happen in isolation. And maybe she needed permission from me, of all people, to decide what to do next. "You don't owe me anything," I said at last, leaning back slightly. "But let me offer you this. If you think this child will fix what's broken between you and Ryan, it won't. Trust me." Her face crumpled slightly, not into tears, but something quieter, sadder. "I know," she whispered. "That's why I came. I needed to say it out loud. to someone who understands what he's capable of. It was almost too much to take in the idea that she now saw him clearly for what he was only after it was too late. Symbolically, this was where our stories diverged completely. Madison was standing where I had stood, once hopeful, then disappointed, then trapped. But I was beyond that now. I had walked through the fire and come out scorched but whole, so I ended it gently. "I wish you well," I said, rising from the table and picking up my coat. "But his story is no longer mine. You'll have to decide for yourself what to carry forward." As I walked out into the bright afternoon, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The meeting had been a risk, yes, but it had given me exactly what I needed: closure, not as a gift from someone else, but as a choice I made for myself. That night, alone in my loft, I packed the last remaining boxes from my old life. Small things I'd brought from the house that no longer held meaning. A vase Ryan had chosen, books we'd bought together, framed photos from trips that felt hollow now. One by one, I set them aside for donation. It wasn't rage or bitterness that drove me. It was a calm recognition that these objects did not define me. Near the bottom of one box, I found the brochure for a small storefront space downtown, a place I had once fantasized about turning into my cafe bookstore. My fingers lingered on its weathered paper, and for the first time in years, the idea felt less like a dream and more like a plan. Freedom, I realized, isn't the absence of pain or conflict. It's the ability to choose what comes next with eyes wide open. The next morning, I met Ethan again, this time deliberately openly, without the weight of shared betrayal hanging between us. We walked through the farmer's market not as potential lovers, not even as confidants bound by trauma, but simply as two people finding joy in the small human things: the scent of fresh bread, the laughter of strangers, the sunlight on ripe peaches. At one point, he paused beside a stand selling handcrafted mugs and picked one up, a simple thing, ceramic, glazed in teal, the same color as the dress I'd worn that fateful night at Elixir. "I thought you should have this," he said, handing it to me with a quiet smile. "It suits you." I laughed softly, accepting it. "Thank you for everything." "No thanks necessary," he replied. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "That you'll stop making yourself small for anyone." His words echoed in me long after we parted ways that day. Not because I needed Ethan's validation, but because they were the kind of words I was ready to say to myself now and mean them. That evening, as twilight wrapped itself gently around the city, I stood at the window of my loft, the teal mug warming my hands, watching the lights come on in apartments and houses and shops below. Each light a story, a life imperfect and messy but beautiful nonetheless. My phone vibrated one last time that day, a message from Ryan. I didn't even open it. I simply deleted it without reading, then turned the phone face down on the counter. This was my peace now. I knew there would be hard days ahead, loneliness would come, doubt would creep back in, and I would grieve not just Ryan, but the version of myself I had lost in that marriage. But grief is not weakness. Grief is proof that I had loved fully even when it wasn't returned in kind. And now finally, I could love myself just as fully. With no rush, no desperation, no shame. The mug in my hand, the soft lamplight illuminating my space, the sound of wind brushing past the window pane, all of it felt sacred in its ordinariness. I was here. I was whole. And I was done performing. As I turned out the lights and walked toward bed, I smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally real. Tomorrow, the world would go on. I would teach my new class, sign the lease on that tiny storefront, and wake up every day knowing that whatever I built from this point forward would be mine, messy, honest, imperfect, and utterly mine. And that was enough. More than enough. Story 2. I'm Nathan Carter, 34, and if you had told me last year that I'd walk away from my entire family without looking back, I would have laughed it off. But betrayal doesn't always arrive with loud fights or dramatic ultimatums. It creeps up quietly hidden under the weight of unspoken expectations until one day it crushes you. For years, I was the steady one, the dependable eldest, the quiet fixer who always stepped in when things fell apart. I had a decent career as a software consultant, not flashy, but comfortable. My car, a 6-year-old Subaru. My apartment clean, modest. My weekends usually consumed handling someone else's problems. My mother, Vivian, 63, worked part-time at a craft store and loved telling everyone she was semi-retired. My father, Ron, 65, still fancied himself a handyman, though every home project somehow ended up costing triple and needing a bailout. My younger brother, Ryan, 30, was in that perpetual finding himself phase, one year a photographer, the next an amateur brewer. And then there was my sister Jenna, 27, a free spirit in the worst possible sense, always posting yoga poses and mindfulness quotes, while her Venmo balance languished near zero. It didn't happen all at once, this slide into becoming their financial safety net. A couple $100s for Ryan's rent when a client ghosted him. A few hundred more when Jenna's vintage VW broke down for the umpteenth time. My parents' property taxes. When did they stop budgeting for those? I rarely protested. It felt easier to help than to deal with the guilt-laced lectures. "We're family, Nathan," my mother would sigh. "Families support each other." And I did. Quietly, predictably. The one thing I kept sacred, the annual Vermont cabin trip, was different. A slice of wilderness that belonged to my late grandfather where we could unplug and reconnect. When he passed, he left it jointly to my dad and my uncle Caleb, a gruff but dependable figure who always treated me like an adult. Every October, like clockwork, I coordinated this trip. I managed the permits, the repairs, the supplies. I even fronted the annual maintenance fee, $1,500 this year alone. My family didn't lift a finger. They simply showed up. So when Jenna called a last-minute family Zoom in early September, I assumed it was to finalize this year's trip. I was already pulling up my spreadsheet, proud that I'd prepaid the cabin caretaker. But the moment I logged on, I knew something was off. The screen filled with too cheerful faces. Mom sipping wine, Dad chuckling at some inside joke, Ryan lounging like he didn't have a care in the world. And then there was Jenna practically glowing as she waved at someone off-screen. That someone was Kyle, Jenna's new boyfriend. The man boy who made a living as a travel influencer, but mostly seemed to drift between couch surfing and Instagram stories about coffee beans. I'd met him once. He called my hiking boots cute vintage cosplay and asked if there was Uber in the forest. "Nathan," Jenna chirped, interrupting my opening sentence. "Guess what? Kyle is coming with us this year. He's so excited to connect with nature." That phrasing, "coming with us," made me pause. "Okay, cool," I said slowly, still trying to steer the call toward logistics. "So, about the trip dates," Ryan cut in. "Oh yeah, about that," he said, glancing sideways at Mom. "We kind of already left." Silence. "Left," I repeated. Mom cleared her throat, looking everywhere but the camera. "Sweetheart, it all came together really fast. Kyle had a gap in his schedule and it seemed easier this way. More spontaneous, less planning." That word planning hung there like an accusation. "I already paid the caretaker," I said flatly. "I blocked off the week at work. You take things so seriously, Nathan." Dad chuckled. "This was just a chance to let go. Relax." The betrayal didn't feel loud. It felt surgical. They'd gone to the cabin, the one I paid for, organized, and kept up without even telling me. Worse, they brought Kyle. The guy who once asked me if hunting season meant there was a bar crawl in town. I didn't argue. I logged off, staring at the blank screen while a cold, clear realization took shape. They hadn't forgotten me, they'd excluded me. And they didn't even feel guilty. For the next few days, my texts to Ryan went unanswered. Jenna sent a breezy, "Hope you're well," with a selfie from the cabin deck. Mom posted pictures of Kyle chopping wood badly with hashtags like #Hermana Nature. That's when it clicked. I had always assumed they leaned on me out of need. But this wasn't need. This was entitlement, expectation. And the final insult, they used my money to fund their spontaneous getaway while treating me like the uptight killjoy they were relieved to leave behind. I poured myself a whiskey that night and opened my laptop not to plead, but to prepare. A spreadsheet glowed back at me, every payment, every utility bill, every auto transfer I'd quietly maintained for them. The total, almost $34,000 in 2 years. If they preferred Kyle's easygoing vibes to my intensity, they could have it. By dawn, I was ready to vanish, not in anger, but in quiet resolve. This was no longer about a trip to the cabin. This was about setting myself free. I didn't sleep that night. The glow of my laptop screen reflected in the whiskey glass as I scrolled through every auto payment, every quiet bailout I'd made for years. Each transaction was a symbol of the unspoken deal I'd had with my family. They could ignore me, belittle me, roll their eyes at my planning because they knew I'd still cover the bills. But what happens when you take the support for granted and then decide you don't even want the person behind it? By 3 a.m., I had a plan, a dangerous one, honestly. Cutting off people who rely on you isn't just a financial decision. It's emotional dynamite. I was about to light a match. The first thing I did was call my bank and kill the auto payments I'd set up for my parents' utilities. Gas, electric, water, all back in their names. Then I revoked the automatic tuition payments for Ryan's online creative entrepreneurship program, the one he never seemed to finish. And Jenna's car insurance gone. She could figure out how to keep her yoga instructor lifestyle intact on her own. The emergency credit card I'd given Dad for repairs was next. I froze it mid-billing cycle. No warning. Each click felt both terrifying and liberating, like I was cutting cords that had tethered me to a sinking ship. But it wasn't just about money. This was about symbols, about reclaiming that sacred Vermont cabin too. I remembered something my grandfather once said when we were sitting by the fireplace. This place isn't for people who just want a vacation. It's for people who respect what it takes to keep it alive. That line hit differently now. Before dawn, I called Uncle Caleb, the one family member who'd always respected me without pretense. They took Kyle up there, Caleb, without even telling me. On my deposit. A pause. They did what? Yeah, I said the words cold but calm. They're sitting in that cabin right now like it's theirs. Caleb let out a low whistle. You want me to come up there with you? No, I said quietly. I need to do this alone. That morning, I packed my old canvas duffel bag, filled the Subaru's tank, and began the 5-hour drive north. The autumn leaves were just starting to turn the kind of gold and crimson that always made me feel small and grounded at the same time. But today, I didn't feel connected to that beauty. I felt like an outsider driving toward a showdown I hadn't asked for, but couldn't avoid. As I drove, I thought about something else my grandfather used to say. A phrase I never understood until now. Respect isn't owed just because you share blood. Simple, but brutal. By the time I reached the gravel path that led to the cabin, I spotted the unmistakable signs that they were there. Ryan's dented Jeep parked sideways across the driveway like he couldn't even be bothered to park properly. Jenna's hatchback plastered with bumper stickers about mindfulness and adventure. And Kyle's car too, a leased SUV that still had the dealer plates on it. I parked quietly and stepped out into the cold mountain air. The sound of laughter carried from the porch. I could see them through the trees, Kyle holding a mug like he was king of the damn woods. Dad laughing at something Kyle said, Jenna sitting cross-legged on the steps as if this was all some Instagram shoot. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to take a slow breath. This was my family. These were the people who'd decided they didn't need me, that I was too intense, too careful, too predictable. And yet they were here using the cabin. I maintained the space. I protected the place that had always been about more than just rustic decor and crackling fires. I didn't barge in. I didn't yell. Instead, I unlocked the maintenance shed around back where the circuit breakers and water main valves were kept and methodically flipped everything off. Electricity gone. Water off. Then I walked quietly to the propane tank and shut that down too. Symbolic, necessary. When the lights flickered out inside, I heard the confusion ripple immediately. The door swung open and there was Kyle barefoot and wearing some ridiculous wool sweater. Dude, what the hell, he called spotting me by the shed. I stayed calm. Power's off, I said simply. Did you turn it off? He asked, looking utterly baffled. Yes. Why would you do that? By now, the rest of them were crowding onto the porch, staring down at me like I was some lunatic. My father stepped forward. Nathan, what's going on? Why are you here? His voice had that tone disbelief followed by exasperation. Like I was the one ruining their plans. Like I was being difficult again. That's when it clicked for me, fully clicked, not just intellectually, but in my gut. I was never going to be appreciated for keeping things afloat. Not once. They didn't respect me because they'd never had to confront what life looked like without me. I stood there a long moment, then looked Dad in the eye. I own 25% of this cabin, I said evenly. His face froze. What? Grandpa amended the deed before he died. Caleb and I each have a quarter stake. You don't get to use this place without me agreeing to it. You could feel the mood shift on that porch. Even Kyle finally stopped posturing. Jenna opened her mouth, but no words came out. Pack up, I said quietly. You're leaving today. And here's the kicker. They didn't even fight me. Not really. Maybe they knew they had no ground to stand on. Maybe they were just embarrassed. But one by one, they began packing. No shouting, no bargaining, just quiet shame. The last thing I did before I locked the cabin behind them was stand alone on the porch for a moment, staring out at the tree line where I used to sit as a kid with Grandpa, listening to him talk about respecting nature and yourself. I felt none of the triumph I thought I would feel. No satisfaction. Just clarity. I wasn't done yet. This was just the first step. And as I locked the door and turned back toward my car, I could feel a bigger storm brewing, a confrontation that would cut deeper than shutting off utilities or reclaiming a cabin. I was finally ready to stop being their silent safety net, and I had no intention of ever going back to how things were. The drive back from the cabin was different. I wasn't angry anymore, not the white-hot rage I felt when I first realized they'd excluded me. That had burned out somewhere between shutting off the water and locking the cabin door. What I felt now was cleaner, colder, and almost surgical resolve. For the first time in years, I was operating purely for myself, not to win their approval or keep peace. The entire drive back to Boston was quiet, except for the occasional hum of tires on wet asphalt. I didn't even bother to turn on the radio. My mind was busy drafting a list, not a spreadsheet this time, but something deeper, a mental inventory of every way they had depended on me, every subtle thread they had wrapped around my life under the label of family. Those threads had felt like duty. Now they felt like chains. When I finally got home, I made one last round of phone calls to cancel my parents' cell phone family plan, which I'd been paying for since 2015, to remove myself as guarantor on Ryan's lease, to formally close the joint account I'd set up with Jenna when she couldn't get her own credit card. Each action felt symbolic, like clearing a table after an indulgent but exhausting dinner party. No shouting, no explanations, just finality. Let them figure it out. Let them actually experience what self-reliance feels like, something I had been practicing silently for years while they coasted on my reliability. 2 days later, the texts began. First, Jenna, short and syrupy. Hey, so weird thing happened, my phone service got cut off. Do you know anything about that, Miss You? I didn't answer. Then Ryan. Dude, the rental office says my co-signer bailed. Are you messing with me? Still silence. And then Mom predictably ratcheted it up a notch. Nathan, your father and I are very worried. We can't reach Jenna or Ryan either. Did something happen? Please call us. This feels petty and beneath you. Beneath me. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. They didn't even realize they were proving my entire point. Their calm, orderly lives had always depended on me quietly taking care of things so they didn't have to. That evening, I sat in my dim apartment, a glass of bourbon in hand, and thought about that cabin again, not just the building itself, but what it symbolized. When I was a kid, that cabin had been my sanctuary, a place where I felt useful, respected, needed. Grandpa never mocked me for double-checking supplies or planning firewood. He'd called it being prepared. But somewhere along the way, my family took that trait and twisted it into a flaw. I could feel it now. They didn't want a son or a brother who planned, who paid, who protected. They wanted someone they could outsource their responsibility to. And the minute I asked for basic respect, they called me rigid, controlling, cold. But here's the truth that had crystallized since that long drive home. Control wasn't my problem. It was their crutch. And I was done being their crutch. 3 days later, Uncle Caleb called. Unlike the rest of them, he didn't beat around the bush. "They're freaking out," he said flatly. "Your mom called me twice today crying. Jenna says you cut her off. Ryan's blaming you for the lease thing, and your dad, well, he's trying to hold it together, but apparently they got a foreclosure notice on the house." I stayed silent for a beat, then asked, "And you, what do you think, Caleb?" He sighed. "I think you finally did what you should have done a long time ago." "But," he trailed off, "they're asking for a family meeting." The phrase hit me like a slap. A family meeting. Like we were going to sit around the living room with coffee and hash this all out like adults. Like they hadn't replaced me with Kyle on a trip I paid for. Like this was just a misunderstanding and not a deliberate exclusion that exposed years of unspoken resentment. But there was one part of me, a small part, that wanted to see them squirm. That wanted them to sit in a circle and realize that I wasn't going to show up with a checkbook and fix everything anymore. That wanted to hear them say out loud what they really thought about me. So I said yes. "Tell them I'll come," I told Caleb. "But I'm not promising anything. I'm not coming to apologize or make this easy. I'm coming so they can look me in the eye and say what they should have said a long time ago." That Sunday, I pulled into my parents' driveway exactly at 6 p.m. I didn't bother to knock. I stood outside for a moment, taking in the sagging gutters, the peeling paint, the dead flowers in the front garden. The house itself had become a symbol of everything wrong with this family, a facade that used to seem solid but was now showing the cracks I'd been patching for years. Inside, they were all assembled in the living room, awkward and jumpy. Jenna perched on the arm of the sofa, arms crossed defensively. Ryan stared at his phone like he could somehow text his way out of this. Mom sat rigidly on the edge of her chair, her face drawn tight with worry. Dad, surprisingly quiet, stood by the fireplace where so many family photos used to hang, but now sat empty. No Kyle in sight, I noted. Probably bailed the second the utilities got cut. I didn't sit down. "So," I said, my voice quiet but sharp, "this is the part where you explain yourselves." The silence that followed was rich, uncomfortable, heavy. Finally, Mom spoke. "Nathan, we didn't mean to hurt you. We just needed a break from all the rules. You always have rules. Rules like paying bills on time, keeping a roof over your heads, making sure no one's car gets repossessed." I asked. "Yeah, those are tough rules." Dad cleared his throat. "Look, son, this whole thing has gotten out of hand. You've made your point, but it's time to get back to normal. Let's not let this ruin the family." And there it was, the phrase I'd been waiting for, get back to normal. But normal wasn't coming back. Because for the first time in my life, I was finally done patching their leaks, done carrying their weight. The silence that followed was different now. I could feel the power shift, quiet but absolute. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there looking around that room at people who had taken me for granted for far too long. And then I simply said, "You keep saying you want things to go back to normal, but this is normal now. You're going to have to learn how to live without me fixing everything." Their faces fell. It was the first time they truly understood I wasn't bluffing. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. I left the family meeting that night with my shoulders square and my mind clear. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking out weighed down by guilt or the exhausting responsibility of fixing what no one else wanted to address. They had shown me exactly who they were, people more comfortable mocking me behind my back than facing the truth when it was in front of them. And for once, I chose not to carry their discomfort for them. As I drove home, the phrase kept echoing in my head, "This is normal now." It was both a declaration and a warning, and I meant every word of it. But the real test wasn't going to be walking out of that room. It was going to be holding the line when their inevitable fallout hit. And it hit fast. The very next morning, Uncle Caleb called again, not to mediate, but to give me a heads up. "They're panicking," he said bluntly. "Your dad's been on the phone with the bank all morning. Jenna's car insurance lapsed officially as of today, and Ryan got notice that he's being evicted next month. Your mom's calling cousins asking for a short-term loan, but, well, let's just say your family reputation has caught up with her. That last part stung more than I expected. It shouldn't have surprised me Mom had spent years spinning a picture-perfect narrative to outsiders while leaning on me to quietly hold everything together, but hearing that her calls for help were falling flat still felt like a small shock. I wasn't immune to the weight of that collapse. I just refused to let it drag me back in. That evening, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered, and of course it was Jenna. Her voice was light, almost playful, as if pretending nothing had happened would reset the whole dynamic. "Nate, listen." She began slipping back into the casual nickname she hadn't used in years. "I was thinking, maybe I overreacted a little. Maybe we all did. Let's get coffee, just you and me. We can talk this out." I closed my eyes and took a breath before answering. "Jenna," I said evenly, "you're not calling because you miss me. You're calling because you need something." There was a pause on the line just long enough to confirm the truth she couldn't admit. "Well, it doesn't have to be like that." "But it is," I said gently. "Look, I don't hate you. I don't hate any of you. I just finally understand that what we had wasn't family, it was dependency. I don't want to go back to that." Her response was a quiet fine followed by the click of disconnection. I stared at the phone for a long moment afterward, not sad exactly, but exhausted by the emotional labor it took to maintain relationships that were built entirely on what I could provide. That exhaustion gave way to something surprising: freedom. Real freedom, not the kind that comes from just saying no to a phone call or declining a family dinner, but the deeper, cleaner freedom of realizing that I was no longer a character in their story. I was writing my own now. Over the next few weeks, I rebuilt routines around this new version of myself. Small things. At first, I replaced my aging couch, started working out more consistently, spent long weekends reading and hiking, not for anyone else, not because it was a checklist item, but because it gave me peace. I didn't talk about my family to coworkers or friends anymore. When they asked, I just said, "We're not close," and left it at that. No explanations, no defenses, just facts. The cabin stayed empty for that first winter, a conscious choice. I visited twice alone, once to install solar panels and upgrade the locks, a symbolic severance from the era when Dad treated it like an open house, and once just to sit on the porch with a coffee and watch the snowfall. Those quiet mornings felt more real than any holiday gathering we'd ever shared. The place felt different now, still mine, still sacred, but reclaimed in a new way. It wasn't a backdrop for obligation anymore. It was a symbol of boundary and peace. And then one afternoon in early spring, something unexpected happened. Uncle Caleb called, not to plead on anyone's behalf, but with an offer. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe it's time I sold my quarter share of the cabin. You're the only one who really cares about the place now. I'm not as young as I used to be, and frankly, I'd like to see it cared for properly before I'm too old to come up there at all." His words hit me harder than I expected. Caleb was the only one who'd ever treated me like an equal in the family, the only one who never mocked my spreadsheets or quiet way of being. But his offer was fair, and I understood the subtext he was letting go too. After a moment's pause, I said, "Yeah, let's talk numbers." That night, I poured myself a bourbon, sat at my kitchen table, and started a new spreadsheet. This one wasn't for anyone else. No auto payments, no hidden gifts, no secret sacrifices. Just a simple, deliberate plan for purchasing Caleb's share of the cabin and turning the place into something new. Maybe a retreat, maybe a rental for hikers and writers, maybe just a quiet place where no one's voice but my own, and maybe a few birds and wind through the trees would fill the air. I didn't feel the need for revenge anymore. The silence I'd given them was punishment enough, and frankly, it wasn't even about punishment at this point. It was about choosing peace over chaos, reality over pretense. And as I reviewed the numbers, a strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe someday, years from now, I'd invite Ryan or Jenna or even Mom and Dad up to the cabin, not out of obligation or guilt, but as equals, as people who'd finally learned to stand on their own. Maybe or maybe not. I didn't need an answer right now. The next morning, I drove up to the cabin again, not to check on repairs or stock firewood or balance anyone else's needs, but just to be there. I sat on that old wooden bench my grandfather built a place that once symbolized tradition and now represented something more radical freedom with boundaries. As the sun set behind the trees, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was the new normal. And for the first time in my life, that felt exactly right.